The day is finally here. This morning, the brand new Sony A7s Mark III was announced, and let me tell you, I am blown away. The Sony A7s Mark II was announced in September of 2015, so we've been waiting for this camera to come out for almost 5 years now, and I think that the wait might be worth it, because this camera is incredible. I've had some beef with Sony in the past, and to be honest, I was wanting to not like this camera, but after seeing what it could do and seeing the footage that it produces, I think I'm hooked. This camera has made it so that I'm no longer purely Team Canon, because Sony has improved every single thing that I didn't like about their other cameras, and in this video we're going to cover all those points and talk about why this camera is so impressive and how it's honestly quite a steal at $3,500. So make sure to stick around to the end, because I'm going to cover every single thing that I love about the camera, and then in the end I'll talk about my absolute favorite feature that literally knocked my socks off when I found out about it. Okay, we're going to start with the resolution and the frame rates. This thing shoots in 4K at up to 120 frames per second and Full HD 1080p at up to 240 frames per second, which is insane. And if you get an external recorder like the Atomos Ninja, you can shoot at up to 4.2K at up to 60 frames per second, which we'll get to in a bit more later in the video. So super impressive frame rates here. My $40,000 Red camera can't even do more than 120 frames per second at 4K, so it's crazy to see that. I also want to mention that this camera is full frame, which is amazing for having a professional and cinematic depth of field, and it's great because you know that the focal length of your lens will actually be the same focal length with what you film with. My Red camera is a Super 35 sensor, so it has a crop factor of 1.4, which means that a 50mm lens is actually more like a 70mm lens, and a 14mm lens is actually more like an 18mm lens. So every time I shoot with a different lens, I need to do some quick math in my head to see what the actual focal length of the lens will look like in camera. Whereas with a full frame camera like the Sony A7s Mark III, a 16mm is actually a 16mm, and a 50mm is actually a 50mm. Next, I want to talk about the in-body image stabilization, or IBIS for short. This camera has a mode called Steady Shot, which has IBIS and digital stabilization working at the same time, and the result is mind-blowing. I wouldn't say that it replaces the need for having a gimbal, but if you're traveling somewhere and can't bring a gimbal with you, or if you're doing a handheld product shoot, this camera is stupidly smooth while shooting handheld. This footage that you see on the screen right now was also shot while doing the ninja walk, so you can't just whip around the camera and expect it to be smooth. You have to hold it steady and kind of walk like you're holding an egg on a spoon, but the results are incredibly impressive. Alright, now let's get into the low light capabilities. This is an area that Sony has always dominated, and this camera doesn't disappoint in that aspect. The Sony A7s Mark III can shoot up to an ISO of 102,400 in normal mode, and then you can extend that ISO to 409,600. I remember 6 years ago a video came out where someone used an A7S to shoot a video just using the light of the moon, and I remember being shocked at how well this camera did in low light, and it's only gotten better since. So if you're going to be shooting in a lot of low light situations, I would highly recommend getting the A7s Mark III. This is another area that absolutely destroys my Red camera, because since Reds are cinema cameras, they were built with the intent of being on Hollywood sets that would always have sufficient lighting. But for a run and gun camera where you don't always have fancy lighting at your disposal, having a camera like the A7s Mark III could be life-saving. Now let's talk about another amazing feature, which is the bit depth. All of the predecessors of this camera could only shoot in 8-bit, but this camera can shoot in 10-bit, and if you buy an external recorder, it can shoot in raw 16-bit color depth, which is the same as a Red camera. So what bit depth does is it basically shows how much you can push an image in color grading without it completely falling apart. A lot of people were complaining that with their previous Sony cameras that shooting in S-Log made it so that every time they would try to color grade their footage, they would see a lot of color artifacts in their image that made it look bad. But because it can now do 10-bit, you can shoot an S-Log 3 without having to worry about the image falling apart. And if you have an external recorder like the Atomos Ninja, you can do 16-bit RAW, which I can't. That's amazing. I have no other words. Now we're getting into my two favorite features about this camera. The first one is that it has 15 stops of dynamic range. Not 12, not even 13 or 14. 15 stops of dynamic range is insane. This means that it's able to capture so much detail in the shadows and the highlights of an image. So you can shoot in a forest where there's a ton of contrasting bright spots and dark spots, and the camera maintains the detail in the shadows and in the highlights. I love this. I love it! This is one of the biggest things that I look for in a camera because if your shadows are crushed or your highlights are blown out, it looks absolutely terrible. So huge shout out to Sony for working hard on their dynamic range and pushing it all the way to get to 15 stops. This is in the same ballpark as Arri and Red cameras, so way to go. Alright, now I want to talk about the thing that has impressed me the most about this camera, and it is the major improvement that Sony has made to their color science. Let me tell you a little story. Years ago, I was shooting on the Canon 1DC, and I had a buddy shooting on the original Sony A7S. This was when I was first getting into filmmaking, and I didn't know a lot about color science, so as he was explaining the specs of his Sony camera to me, I was so impressed. I started looking into buying one, and as I started playing around with his camera, I noticed that as I was editing footage from his camera, that the colors did not look good. The greens looked really yellow and pukey, and there was a lot of magentas in the shadows, the skin tones didn't look right, and the whole image just looked off. So that was when I realized that Canon's color science was way better than Sony. But throughout the years, Sony has slowly improved their color science, and now I would say that their color science is right up to par with Canon, if not even better than Canon. So just a little tip for you, anytime you're looking at buying a new camera, it doesn't matter how impressive the specs of the camera is, make sure that you do enough research and look at tons of footage from the camera, and even try to get your hands on some of the raw footage to play around with yourself, because it could have the most impressive specs in the world, but if it has bad color science, you're screwed. So way to go, Sony, you did it. You improved your color science, and now you have my stamp of approval. A few of the other features that I love about this camera is that it has a flip-out screen that articulates, amazing battery life, you can record for more than 30 minutes at a time, it has a mic jack, and no overheating. Sorry, Canon. So if you're thinking about getting the new Sony A7s Mark III, I would strongly recommend getting an external recorder like the Atomos Ninja to go along with it. This will allow you to shoot with a little bit more resolution, it will give you 16-bit color depth and RAW instead of 10-bit color depth, and it will give you a bigger screen to look at than the small flip-out screen on the Sony camera. So you'll be looking at an extra $1,000 or so with the external recorder, batteries for it, and some SSD cards, but I would say that it's worth it. Now it's all super fun talking about new cameras and specs and how impressive technology has gotten. I love talking about that, and I probably will always talk about new fancy cameras, but I also want to make the point that it's less about the camera and it's more about your skill as a filmmaker that will allow you to make amazing videos. You could have the best camera in the world, but if you haven't been taught properly, or if you don't know how to use that camera to its maximum potential, then you're still going to come out with just a mediocre image. That's why I want to talk to you guys about my online courses, which you can check out below in the description. In these courses, I teach you how to get the best image out of any camera. I personally mentor and train you and teach you how to get professional cinematic looking images and how to grow your production company to become your full-time job, which will allow you to travel the world and do what you love. I wouldn't talk about this unless I knew the impact that it has on my students, because I get messages every week from people telling me how much the course has impacted them and taught them. So if you're looking at becoming a professional filmmaker and taking your filmmaking skills to the next level, I would strongly recommend checking out the courses down below in the description. But other than that, thanks so much for watching. Go ahead and leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this, and we'll see you in the next one.